This is Dr. Wendy Widder in her teaching on the book of Daniel. This is session number 6, Daniel 3, God's superior power and his servants' faithfulness.
In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Daniel 3, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, probably one of the most popular and famous stories from the book of Daniel. This chapter, if I were to summarize what it's about, I would say it's about God's superior power and his servants' faithfulness. So the God of Israel is going to demonstrate how his power to deliver especially is greater than that of King Nebuchadnezzar, is greater than that of the Babylonian gods, and the faithfulness of his servants is commendable and even admired by the foreign king by the end of the chapter. First of all, let's get our bearings where we are in the narrative chapters of Daniel. So we have this chiasm. Chapter 2 is the statue dream, which is concerned with 4 earthly kingdoms and a 5th eternal kingdom. Chapter 3, where we're at right now, is Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the fiery furnace. So we have 3 faithful Jews who are going to be threatened with death on account of their faithfulness. Chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, in which he dreams about a tree, a great tree. And then he is judged by God. That's the meaning of the dream. Because of his pride, God judges him. Chapter 5 will be the story of Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. And just like chapter 4, it's God's judgment on a human king for their pride, but with significant differences. Chapter 6 is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. A story, again, of a faithful Jew who faces death because of his faithfulness to God. And then chapter 7, Daniel's going to have a vision of his own, in which he sees 4 mutant beasts rising out of a raging sea. It's going to turn out to be about 4 earthly kingdoms and the 5th eternal kingdom of God. So in this chiastic structure, we are right here. So we're looking at a story that a little bit later, we're going to look at its counterpart. Both stories about God's faithful people who face death because of their faithfulness to God, and God miraculously delivers them out of it, proves himself to be more powerful than the gods of the foreign country. So that's where it fits in the chiasm. This chapter is also one of the court stories. So it's about, at its most basic level, it's about foreign captives who are serving in the court of a king and who actually prove themselves to be superior to the king's regular staff. Although that's the least of this chapter's concerns. This chapter is not concerned necessarily to elevate Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as some kind of model of faithfulness, although they certainly are. Its primary reason is to showcase the superiority of their God. So I'm going to read this story because this one really has to be heard. It has so much repetition that halfway through it, the audience should almost be saying it along with me. There's so much of it that you can just repeat. I'm going to be reading the ESV again, but I'm going to make a couple adaptations, inserting my own preferred translation that's a little more wooden or faithful to the original Aramaic, and it kind of brings out the repetition a little bit better, I think, than the ESV does. So, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the image of gold. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. If you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies, rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. All right, so that is the story. Lots of repetition. And some of that repetition is just entertaining. I think some of it might also be intended to be a little bit mocking. So we have Nebuchadnezzar the king and the image of gold that he set up. It's repeated 4, 5, 6, maybe even 9 times. This focus on the image that the king set up. The key theme behind all this is that this chapter is about idolatry. And how are these captive Jews going to respond when they face idolatry, when they face the pressure to worship a god other than their own? All right, so the first 7 verses, let's look at them a little more closely. We have Nebuchadnezzar really makes his first display of his own power here. So remember, this chapter is about God's superior power. But in order for God to have superior power, we need to see the king he's being superior over. So Nebuchadnezzar makes a couple shows of power in this chapter. In the first 7 verses, what does he do? Well, he makes this image of gold. By the way, that doesn't give us a time frame. We don't have a date formula in this chapter. It just jumps right in. Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. This follows chapter 2, obviously. And chapter 2 had a date formula, you might remember, and that was in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar. For whatever reason, chapter 3 doesn't give us one. It's possible that we're supposed to bring that idea of that statue with us into chapter 3. It doesn't tell us why Nebuchadnezzar built this statue, just that he made this huge image of gold. Chapter 2, he dreamed about an image that had a gold head, and he was the head of gold, right? Now, I don't know that the narrator believes, or that we are to believe, that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about a statue, therefore he made a statue, even better than the one he dreamed about. The narrator doesn't say that, but he does put these 2 stories right up against each other. So at the very least, you're coming out of a story in which you have this powerful king, and here he is showing his power. He's flexing his muscles almost. He's making a statue that's even bigger than the one we just, or even more grand than the one we just saw. That one was just a gold head. He's got a statue that's entirely of gold. The statue is described in what might be exaggerated language. We're not sure, but if you did the measurements, I don't expect that you know cubits. I don't know cubits either. The text says it's 60 cubits by 6 cubits. Well, what that comes out to is this statue is 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That is really out of proportion for the statue of a human figure. It might mean that it's supposed to be kind of grotesque in your mind, that this is a really out of proportion. Nebuchadnezzar builds this as a splendid display of his power, but really? Maybe not. Another possibility is that it's a smaller statue atop an obelisk or like a totem pole. We do have some evidence of things like this, much better than that in the ancient Near East. We don't really know. The point in the chapter is that he's made this statue, and he thinks it's pretty great, and everybody in the nation is supposed to come and bow down before it. We don't know if it was actually a representation of Nebuchadnezzar either. It doesn't tell us. It could have been a representation of one of his gods. It could have been of him. We don't know. What matters is that it represents something else these Jews are going to be called to worship, and that in itself is going to be idolatry. Let's see. So we have these lists of officials that appear several times, and we could parse them out and talk about what each one of these groups of officials was responsible for. I think the point of the text is that everybody who was anybody was there. Nebuchadnezzar summoned all the bigwigs, all the powers of the day, and they are to come and follow his command to bow before this statue. You sort of get this idea of this grand occasion. There's all these officials, there's all these instruments, just this repetition builds up this grandiose nature of this dedication event. So in this first chapter, we've got the king who sets up this magnificent, or so he thinks, statue. He makes a display of his power, and you get this idea from what the king says and what the people do, that the king speaks and everybody answers. Everybody responds. Nebuchadnezzar builds it, calls the people, all those people come. Nebuchadnezzar says, bow down, all those people bow down. This automatic response to what the king says. So he has the power to control all of these people. And then we get to verses 8 through 12, second section. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward. This is where they maliciously accused the Jews. I won't read it all again. I already read it. But they come forward and they accuse the Jews. It's interesting that it tells us they were Jews. And they actually tell the king that there are certain Jews, not just certain Jews, but ones that you, O king, appointed. There's probably some overtones of ethnic prejudice here. And they've been promoted over these officials, so they are out to get these guys. It's also interesting to notice that this is not, they didn't lay a trap. When we get to Daniel 6, we'll have his colleagues laying a trap, like devising something that Daniel can't help but disobey. In this chapter, they're not quite that malicious. They're really opportunists. You know, they're standing there watching this dedication ceremony. Everybody falls except those three, although it kind of suggests that maybe the Chaldeans didn't bow either. I'm not sure what we are to think of that. How did they know that those three men remained standing? We have all kinds of questions when we read biblical narrative, and the author's often not interested to answer our questions, but it's good to think about them. So for whatever reason, they don't like these men, probably in part because they're Jews, because they've been promoted over them. And even though they're malicious, the text tells us they're malicious, their accusation in part is true, right? They are correct that these three men did not bow down, and the king's edict was bow down or be killed. So they're correct. The three men do, according to the law, deserve death. So even though they're malicious, they're still at this point speaking mostly the truth. The refusal to bow down by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have been seen as an act of treason and insubordination. So it follows that Nebuchadnezzar would issue a death sentence for that sort of behavior. The third section, in verses 13 through 18, we have this confrontation between Nebuchadnezzar the king and these three servants, these three Jews who have not bowed down. This is going to be the heart of the chapter. This is where Nebuchadnezzar is going to blow up, and he's going to present to these three Jews the challenge of the chapter, the challenge that he is making to their God. And his challenge is, who is a God, or who is the God who can deliver you from my hand? I'm more powerful than any God you might have. There is no God who can deliver you. And that's a challenge that the God of Israel will take. And as we move through the chapter, he will respond in resounding ways, and Nebuchadnezzar will be left stunned and amazed at the power of this God. So first of all, the king offers them a second chance to obey. So the three men are brought before them, and he's furious, but he says, is it true that you didn't fall down to worship? Here's a second chance. We'll start it all over. We'll go back to the beginning. We'll play the music. And okay, then you fall down and worship. But if you don't, in case you missed it the first time, if you don't, you'll be cast into the fire. Who is the God who will deliver you from my hand? Why was he lenient with them? Why didn't he just throw them in the fire? They disobeyed. They were treasonous. The text doesn't say. It may be because he's already invested a significant amount of time and effort and even resources in training these civil servants. So maybe he wants to keep them, or maybe he just wants them to conform. He doesn't want to give them the satisfaction of disobeying him. I don't know. It's interesting to think about. But his suggestion to them in this challenge is that he is more powerful than any God that's out there. That is quite a claim. This is a human king claiming to be more powerful than any God these three men might be serving. Who really has the power? Nebuchadnezzar's claiming to have ultimate power, and the God of Israel has been challenged to respond to that. This actually sounds similar to a story we have back in 2 Kings, where the Assyrians were occupying around Jerusalem, and Sennacherib had Hezekiah, I think the inscription says something like a caged bird in Jerusalem. There was no place to go. They were going to lose. And Sennacherib's captain mocked the people in Jerusalem. Has any god of any nation ever delivered someone from Sennacherib's hand? It's almost an echo of what, or this is almost an echo in Daniel of what Sennacherib's captain had said to the Jerusalemites. The king of Assyria is so powerful that there's no God who can deliver. Then we get to this very famous text passage where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego speak. What's interesting in this chapter is this is the only time they speak. It's the only thing they say that we hear, and it's all three of them together. In this chapter, it's not Shadrach, and over here's Meshach, here's Abednego. They're like one character together. In some ways, they're representative of a faithful Jew. Just as a unit, they represent this faithful Jew. This is actually a difficult text. It's got a few issues, a few problems, things that translators actually aren't quite sure what to do with. So let's talk through what some of those are. The very first one comes when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar." That does not sound like proper protocol. You would never just say to a king, "O Nebuchadnezzar." You would say, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever," or whatever protocol all went along with that. But you would never just address the king by his name. So there's two approaches to this, and it has to do with how the Aramaic is and how the accents go, and I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm just going to say that the two ways translators deal with this is they, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to King Nebuchadnezzar, and then they say, we do not need to defend ourselves. Or Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego said, actually not even king, "O Nebuchadnezzar." Some translations will include this king and some won't. What's the difference? Well, you can see even structurally what the difference is. Here they don't use his title king. Here they're not actually in their speech saying his name at all. This is more respectful. Okay? The only thing that would have been even more respectful is if they said, "Oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever," blah, blah, blah. But at least here they aren't just saying his name. Okay? They haven't just plowed in and addressed him. Here, you almost have what sounds like impudence or impudence, this disrespect, actually. So the way you read this actually affects how you read the rest of what they say. If they're speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar with this chip on their shoulder, you're going to read everything else they say with this defensive tone to it. If you read it as they have respect for the king, they're respecting the proper protocol, that colors the way you hear the rest of what they say also. So it's interesting. We're not going to settle it. My choice actually is the one that goes along with the, let's see. Let me give you some of the examples of which versions do what. So the ESV, English Standard Version, they said to Nebuchadnezzar, or they said to the king. NASB, NASB, KJV. If you say they said, I think I confused those. But if you were to look at various translations, you'll see the difference in how this gets translated. And it will affect where you go and your understanding of what they say. We don't have any reason to think they're being disrespectful. And if you look at the example of Daniel in the previous chapter and in every chapter to follow, Daniel is very respectful of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not so with Belshazzar. And there will be reasons for why he seems to be terse with Belshazzar. But if you were just to base what you think their response was on how Daniel responded and how these four men acted in the first chapter. Very respectful. They approached things the right way. That might lean you in the direction of saying, well, they're being respectful. I'll leave it up to you. That's the least of the questions in this text. Let's look at I'm going to give you several of the translation options for what they actually said, besides Nebuchadnezzar or O King, or no introduction at all. Okay. So the version I read, which is the ESV, and this is going to agree with the KJV, King James, and with the New American Standard. This translation is going to say something to the effect of, if it be so, our God, I'm going to just leave some things out here, is able to deliver us. And this it has to refer to something. It's a pronoun. It's replacing something. It's going to refer all the way back to the king's threat to throw them into the furnace. So if indeed, king, you've threatened to throw us into the furnace for our disobedience, if that's the way it is, our God is able to deliver us. Okay? That's the first option. The second option, the reason we have these options, let me explain that, is there's this anomalous sentence structure in the original Aramaic that we just don't know exactly what to do with it. So these are translators' versions of how we might deal with the difficult structure. Okay, this next one is the NET translation, which is New English. I don't know, I know it's an online translation. I'm not sure if it's actually available in hard copy or not. This translation says, if our God exists, he is able to rescue us. Do you see the difference? This first one is, if you've made this threat, if that's really the way it is, our God is able to deliver us. This one, if our God exists, he's able to rescue us. We could just say deliver. That would be one less difference to deal with. Same word. So the question here is they're responding to is whether or not their God exists. The third option is that of the NIV, New International Version, and the NLT, the New Living Translation. And that one says, if we are thrown in, the God we serve is able to deliver us, etc., etc. So this is quite a bit different, although in some ways it's similar to this. So if your threat is true, if that's really the way it is, our God's able to deliver us. This one, if we're thrown in, the God we serve is able to deliver us. All right? Fourth option. This is found in the New Revised Standard, the NRSV, and the New American Bible, and also the JPS or the Tanakh. This one says, if our God is able, he will deliver us. That's significantly different, isn't it? Every one of these is responding to a slightly different challenge. If our God is able, he will deliver us. In my opinion, what I know about Aramaic and what I've worked with it, and other commentators think this too, this is actually probably the most faithful to what the structure seems to say, but we don't like it. We don't like it because it presents us with what looks like a theological difficulty. If our God is able, of course their God was able. How is that even a question here? We don't like it because it makes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look not quite as good, right? It looks like they're doubting their God. So a lot of people don't really like it. It makes us a little uncomfortable. But I'm not sure that's a reason to discount it. If we discounted everything in the Bible that made us uncomfortable, we'd be in trouble. Remember, this is not a statement, a biblical statement of truth. By that I mean this is not a biblical proposition that God is able to deliver. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego speaking. So this is reflecting their thoughts, perhaps their doubts. I don't know. Why might they have doubts? Where are they? Why are they there? They're in exile because their God had not delivered them from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we can talk through that theologically about how we know God gave them into, but they weren't reading Daniel 1. They didn't have that. And maybe it's possible that these three men, as this composite of the Jews, this composite representation of the Jews, maybe in some way they're reflecting doubt that the people had. Why didn't our God deliver us? It's possible. It's a difficult passage, and it gives you lots of things to sort of muse about, right? There is one last option that's come out in the last year. It's in a journal article in 2019 by somebody named John Cook, who has done a lot of work with grammar in Hebrew and Aramaic. And he proposes that the best way to read this, and I'm going to have to back it up a little bit because he takes a little bigger chunk than just this. He translates it as, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need concerning this matter to respond to you whether our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. From the furnace of burning fire and from your hand, O king, he may deliver us. But even if not, and then goes the rest of it. So he's done a little reshaping of clauses. And he defends this in the article. I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But rather than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego even entertaining the king's suggestion that their God might not be able, they just put that aside. Whether or not our God is able is not the issue, king. He might deliver us, he might not. We're not going to bow down. So that's your fifth option. When you are reading your Bible, whatever version it is, just notice the view that the translators have taken, the way that they've dealt with that. At the end of the day, what really matters is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not going to bow down. Even if they die, they're not going to bow down. And that's actually kind of amazing to think about. If this is really what they said, and that they're still not going to bow down, think about that. They are claiming that they will be faithful to their God regardless of what he actually does for them. They will not violate the first and second commandments, no matter what. So even if, we'll just allow the possibility that they're reflecting doubt, even if they doubt, they're still faithful. And I don't know about you, but that, for me, is the hardest time to be faithful, when you doubt. When you have firm faith, okay, it's a little bit easier to obey. But when you're not actually sure what on earth God is doing, and yet you're faithful, that speaks well of your commitment to God. So I'm not sure we should dismiss Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego if they had a little bit of doubt. I don't know. I think they still set an example that impresses Nebuchadnezzar. He is impressed at the end of the chapter with their God, but also with their commitment to their God. Whatever their attitude, whether they said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar," or just plain old Nebuchadnezzar, whatever their attitude, whatever exactly they said, there's no doubt what they meant. They're not going to conform. And if their God does not deliver them, Nebuchadnezzar, this powerful king, is shown to really be powerless because he couldn't even get these three men, these three measly captives. He's not powerful enough to get them to bow down to him. So he's really shown to be weak just by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response. They have more power than the king does, and their God has more power than the king does. Well, you can imagine that Nebuchadnezzar does not respond well to this in verses 19 and 20. He makes a second display of power in this chapter. He's furious. He's filled with wrath. This chapter loves these hot words. And you have the king getting angry. He's enraged. You have the furnace getting hot. Then you have the king get angrier, and you have the furnace get hotter. And it's almost like, which is hotter, the king or the furnace? There's just blown up. It says he heated it 7 times hotter. You, again, can't measure that. 7 is the number of completion. So this furnace is as hot as it can possibly be. And who does he call on to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire? Some of his mightiest men. Here's another show of power. And what happens when they throw them in? His mightiest men fall dead. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall in alive and live through it. What's the point of talking about all these clothes they're wearing? Probably just to show you how flammable they are. These guys are wearing all sorts of baggy clothes. They've got cloaks, tunics, hats, and other garments. And they're bound up. There's no way they should escape. And yet, they come out without even a smell of smoke on them. That's jumping ahead. So Nebuchadnezzar makes this grand display of his power, and he really ends up looking kind of foolish. He just killed some of the mightiest men he had. It's this caricature of the king so angry. He's just a maniac. Verse 21 through 25, God responds to Nebuchadnezzar's display of power, and he makes his own display of power instead. And in this section, we have this contrast between these men. There's 2 groups of these men, or your translation might say those men. Translations vary. But these men refers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego several times. And then it also refers to the mighty men. So these men took these men and threw them into the fire, and these men dropped dead, and these men walked around. So you've got this contrast of these mighty men of Nebuchadnezzar and these weak, bound captives. And yet, which ones come out on top? The king leaps to his feet when this happens. He sees 4 men. Now, the text does not tell us if anybody else saw this 4th man. All we know is that Nebuchadnezzar reports seeing him. He asks his officials, "How many men? Did we throw in 3? "Oh, yes, king, we threw in 3. Well, the king could have said, "Didn't we throw in 20? And they probably would have said, "Oh, yes, king, we threw in 20. No one's going to disagree with Nebuchadnezzar at this point in the story. He sees this 4th man, and whether Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw the 4th man, we don't actually know. It doesn't tell us. The only one who reports seeing the 4th man is Nebuchadnezzar. We'll talk about why that is significant when we get to the end of the chapter. Nebuchadnezzar says that this 4th man has the appearance of the son of the gods. There are a couple translations out there that will say the appearance of the Son of God. That is actually not a good rendering of what's in the Aramaic. It's a son of the gods. And what Nebuchadnezzar means is he is looking at what he considers to be a supernatural being. He will later say God sent his angel. So he's seeing this 4th figure as a divine being, and it's a member of what we might call the class of gods. This is not a human being along with the other 3 human beings. Notice that the men are not rescued from the fire. They are not saved from going into the fire. They fall right into it. But they are with a divine being in the fire. I just want to caution you when you read this chapter or you teach this chapter or whatever, that you don't use this story as a promise that God will deliver faithful people. I've heard that. I've heard it applied that way, that, oh, they were faithful, so God delivered them. I'm not sure that's why God delivered them. God delivered them for his own glory, to display his own power over this king. If they hadn't been faithful, he still might have delivered them, according to some of these translations. He might have. What if you are faithful and you end up being martyred? Does that mean your faith wasn't great enough? I don't think we want to say to the martyrs of the church that they weren't faithful enough, and that's why God didn't deliver them. That's not the message of the chapter. It's describing, remember, that's describing how God worked and what happened. It's not prescribing that if you do this, then God will do this. So just a caution. Then we get to the last section. Nebuchadnezzar calls them out. They don't have a scent on them. The witnesses to that are the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors. They all gathered together, and they don't see any evidence that they were in the fire, except there's one piece of evidence they were in the fire. Their ropes had fallen off. Their ropes had been burned off. So they were free. They were walking around in the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar is very impressed by this. He makes this really great doxology, this statement about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And for the first part of his statement, you're like, wow, Nebuchadnezzar, you're making progress. Praise, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel. He delivered his servants who trusted in him. They set aside the king's command. They gave up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god but their own. Yay, Nebuchadnezzar. And then he says, therefore I make a decree. If anybody speaks anything against this God, I'm going to tear you limb from limb. So Nebuchadnezzar is learning, but he's learning in small steps, right? In chapter 2, he learned that the God of Daniel was able to reveal mysteries. That God had superior knowledge to anything he had ever seen before. In this chapter, he encounters the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has superior power. Who's the God who can deliver you from my hand? Answer, the God of Israel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He is impressed by that. I want to return for just a second to this question of the fourth man, this fourth figure in the fire. What was he doing there, and why was he there? Did God need that fourth figure in the fire to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? No. He could have just spared them, right? That fourth figure is walking around with them. He's not shielding them. He's not covering them with fireproof anything. He's just there with them. God didn't need that. God's the one that delivered the men, not the fourth figure. So what was the angel doing there at all? Well, in the text, like I said, the only one who sees or acknowledges seeing it is Nebuchadnezzar. That fourth figure was there for Nebuchadnezzar. It was there for his benefit. Two things it did for Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, it showed the king a display of God's power. It's not just, these three men didn't just fall in the fire and by their own power not get burned, but there's a fourth divine figure there. This is showing Nebuchadnezzar the power of the God to deliver, the God that he challenged even existing. The second thing I think this figure did for Nebuchadnezzar is it kept him from thinking that the power was in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were not the ones who delivered themselves. They were not gods. So that fourth figure, for whatever other reasons it may have been there, maybe it comforted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we don't know. Maybe everybody else saw it, we don't know. What the narrator cares about is that Nebuchadnezzar saw this fourth figure because God was showing him that he was the one with the power. He was answering Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. So at the end of this chapter, what's its main points for us, its takeaway value? I think this message of idolatry, this is the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, and no matter what it was going to cost God's followers, They weren't going to bow down. They were going to be faithful no matter what. Genuine commitment to God is one of principle. Because he's God, because he's worthy, because he demands it, not for whatever benefit you might gain from it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not committed because they were going to be saved. They did not see this as their fire insurance, so to speak. They were committed because he was God, and they were going to follow him no matter what. And I think a second thing just to keep in mind is faithfulness does not guarantee deliverance. In fact, when we get to the chapters 8 through 12 of Daniel, we're going to see God's people suffer even greater things than these three guys suffered. We're going to see martyrs. We're going to see people who there's no hope for them apart from cataclysmic restoration by God. But even in the midst of whatever suffering there is, God was with these three, and he is with us. And I'm not taking that promise just from Daniel 3. The Bible assures us in some other very clear passages that God is with us. God is with his people. That's the hope of persecuted believers. We'll come back and do chapter 4.
This is Dr. Wendy Widder in her teaching on the book of Daniel. This is session number 6, Daniel 3, God's superior power and his servants' faithfulness.